Listen carefully, because tonight, these 12 Christmas Eve rules are the only thing standing between you and something that wants in. This isn't holiday cheer, it's a countdown to terror. Break even one rule and you don't just ruin Christmas. You invite a nightmare that knows your name, your house, and exactly when the lights go out. The snow fell in thick, lazy curtains outside Grandmother Eleanor's farmhouse, coating the world in a pristine blanket of white that seemed to swallow all sound from beyond the frosted windows. Inside, the warmth of the crackling fireplace wrapped around our family like a familiar embrace, filling the air with the scent of burning oak and cinnamon. Christmas carols drifted softly from an antique radio in the corner, the kind that still required manual tuning, and the living room glowed amber beneath strings of lights that had adorned this house for longer than I had been alive. It was the picture of holiday perfection, the kind of scene you might find on a vintage greeting card, and for years I had believed that was all it was. My family had gathered here every Christmas Eve for as long as anyone could remember. My parents, my younger brother Marcus, my teenage sister Lily, and myself, we made the 3-hour drive through winding mountain roads each year without fail. Grandmother Eleanor insisted upon it, and there was something in her insistence that had always felt less like invitation and more like requirement. She stood by the fireplace now, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a holly-embroidered headband, watching us settle into the worn armchairs and ancient sofas with an expression that walked the line between warmth and vigilance. The presents sat beneath a towering Douglas fir, wrapped in red and gold paper that caught the firelight and threw dancing reflections across the ceiling. A pot of hot cocoa simmered in the kitchen, its sweet aroma mingling with the scent of the pine needles and the roasting chestnuts grandmother had placed by the hearth. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had always been. And yet, as I watched my grandmother move toward the old mahogany cabinet beside the window, a familiar chill crept down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She withdrew a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded with age, the spine barely holding its pages together. I recognized it immediately. We all did. The Rules of Christmas Eve, she called it, and every year she read them aloud as the clock struck 6. Her voice carrying a weight that transformed what should have been charming eccentricity into something far more solemn. "Gather round," she said, and though her tone was gentle, none of us hesitated. Marcus rolled his eyes at me as we moved closer, the skepticism of a 16-year-old written plainly across his face. Lily merely sighed, her attention half claimed by the phone she was forbidden to use once the reading began. My parents exchanged glances that I could not quite interpret, a silent communication that seemed to carry more meaning than I understood. I was 23 years old, far past the age of believing in holiday superstitions, and yet something about the way grandmother opened that journal made the hairs on my arms stand at attention. "These rules have been in our family for 7 generations, she began, her voice steady but her eyes sharp. They are not suggestions. They are not quaint traditions to be mocked or dismissed. They are the only things that keep this household safe on the longest night of the year." I had heard these words before, of course, every Christmas Eve without variation. But this year, something in her delivery felt different. There was an urgency beneath the familiar recitation, a tremor in her hands that I had never noticed before. She began to read. Rule 1. The stockings must be hung before midnight. Rule 2. All windows must remain locked from dusk until dawn. Rule 3. No peeking at presents under any circumstances. Rule 4. The youngest must never sleep alone. Rule 5. Leave a plate of cookies and milk by the hearth, untouched until morning. The rules continued, 12 in total, each one stranger than the last. Some seemed reasonable enough, rooted in the kind of superstitious caution that older generations often clung to. Others made little sense at all. Rule 8. Do not answer the door after dark, no matter who appears to be standing there. Rule 10. No carols are to be sung or played after midnight. Rule 12. The feast must be shared with all, even those who do not seem to eat. When she finished, grandmother closed the journal with deliberate care and returned it to the cabinet. The lock clicked into place with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. "I know you think these are foolish," she said, looking at each of us in turn. "But tonight I am asking you to trust me. I am asking you to follow every rule exactly as written. Not for my sake, but for your own. There was something in her eyes then, something that looked almost like fear, and it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Grandmother Eleanor was not a woman who frightened easily. She had lived alone in this isolated farmhouse for 15 years since grandfather passed, had weathered storms and power outages and the creeping loneliness of rural life without complaint. To see her afraid was to see the world tilted slightly off its axis. The clock on the mantel chimed 7, and the fire popped and hissed, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, rattling the shutters with a sound that resembled fingernails tapping against wood. The carols continued to play from the old radio, but their cheerfulness now felt hollow, a fragile barrier against something I could not name. I did not know it then, but the night had already begun its descent into darkness. And somewhere beyond the snow-laden trees, something ancient and patient had awakened to the familiar scent of tradition. The first rule was broken by accident, though I suppose that is how it always begins. Marcus had been sulking in the corner of the living room for most of the evening, resentful of the phone prohibition and the isolation from his friends on a night when everyone else was sending holiday messages and posting photographs of their celebrations. When grandmother retired to the kitchen to prepare dinner, he saw his opportunity. The stockings had been laid out on the coffee table, waiting to be hung on the brass hooks that lined the mantel. This task traditionally fell to the youngest member of the family, and Marcus had performed it every year since he was old enough to stand on his own 2 feet. But this year, consumed by his teenage rebellion and the burning desire to check his phone just once, he slipped upstairs to his room and forgot entirely about the task assigned to him. None of us noticed immediately. The fire continued to burn, the carols continued to play, and the snow continued to fall in great white sheets beyond the windows. It was only when the clock struck 11 that grandmother returned to the living room and saw the unstung stockings lying where she had left them. The color drained from her face with such sudden completeness that for a moment I feared she might collapse. "Who was supposed to hang these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My mother pointed toward the ceiling, toward the room where Marcus had retreated. Grandmother's hand went to her throat, clutching at the silver pendant she always wore, the one shaped like a sprig of holly with thorns that looked sharper than decorative jewelry had any right to be. "Bring him down," she said. "Now." I went upstairs to fetch my brother, climbing the narrow staircase that groaned beneath my weight with sounds I had never noticed before. The hallway on the second floor was darker than I remembered, the single bulb overhead casting a sickly yellow glow that left the corners thick with shadow. Marcus's door was closed, and when I knocked, there was no response. I pushed it open to find him sitting on the edge of his bed, his phone illuminating his face with pale blue light. But there was something wrong with his expression. His eyes were fixed on the screen, yet they did not seem to be reading anything. They were wide, unblinking, focused on something I could not see. "Marcus," I said, and when he did not respond, I said it again, louder this time. He turned to look at me, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, I could have sworn his pupils were shaped wrong. Not round, but elongated, like the eyes of a cat or something older and less familiar. Then he blinked, and everything was normal again, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. We returned downstairs together, where grandmother was already hanging the stockings herself, her movements hurried and frantic despite the arthritis that usually slowed her hands. The clock now showed 5 minutes to midnight, and she worked with desperate efficiency, hook after hook, stocking after stocking. She finished with seconds to spare, stepping back from the mantel just as the clock began its midnight chime. The fire crackled and popped, and outside the wind fell suddenly, completely silent. For 12 long seconds, not a single sound penetrated the walls of that old farmhouse. Even the radio seemed to hold its breath, the carol cutting off mid-note as if waiting for permission to continue. Then the chiming stopped, and the wind returned, and grandmother released a breath I had not realized she was holding. "Too close," she murmured. "Far too close." I wanted to ask what would have happened if she had not finished in time, but something in her expression warned me against it. Instead, I returned to my chair by the fire and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. It was shortly after 1 in the morning when Lily decided to break Rule 3. I was half asleep on the sofa, drifting in that liminal space between consciousness and dreams, when I heard her footsteps creeping across the floor. My eyes opened just enough to see her kneeling beside the Christmas tree, her fingers working at the tape on a small rectangular package. "Lily," I whispered, too tired to raise my voice. "Don't." She glanced back at me with the dismissive confidence of someone who has never faced consequences for her actions. "It's just a peek," she said. "Grandmother's asleep. No one will know." She tore back the corner of the wrapping paper just enough to glimpse what lay beneath. The moment she did, the lights on the Christmas tree flickered and died. All of them simultaneously, as if someone had pulled the plug. But the tree was not plugged into anything electrical. Those were the old-fashioned candles, the kind grandmother insisted upon despite the fire hazard, and they should not have been able to extinguish themselves so completely, so suddenly. In the darkness that followed, I heard Lily gasp, not in surprise but in fear. Deep, primal fear that made her voice crack as she whispered, "There's something under the tree." I sat up, my heart beginning to pound against my ribs. "What do you mean?" But she was already scrambling backward, her eyes fixed on the space beneath the lowest branches. I followed her gaze, and in the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw it. A shape, too long to be a shadow, too solid to be imagination. It moved with a slow, deliberate sinuousness, like something tasting the air. Then the candles reignited all at once and the shape was gone. But Lily would not go near the tree for the rest of the night, and when morning came, the present she had peeked at was nowhere to be found. By the second night, the fireplace had become my prison. Not literally, of course, but grandmother had assigned me the task of watching the flames with such stern insistence that I dared not look away for more than a few seconds. Rule 6, she reminded me. The fire must never go out. Not even for a moment. Not even if the flames seemed to flicker and threaten to die of their own accord. I did not understand the importance of this rule until approximately 3 in the morning, when exhaustion finally claimed me and my eyes fell closed despite my best efforts to keep them open. The fire had been burning strong when I last checked, fed by the careful arrangement of logs I had maintained throughout the night. But fires are hungry things, and without constant attention, they consume their fuel and leave nothing but cooling ash. I woke to cold. Not the ordinary cold of a winter night, but something deeper, something that seemed to seep into my bones and crystallize the moisture in my breath. The living room had transformed in my absence. Frost climbed the inside of the windows in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language I could not read. The Christmas lights had dimmed to a faint, sickly glow, and the air itself felt thick, resistant, as if something had filled the space while I slept. The fire had gone out completely. Not even embers remained. I scrambled for the matches grandmother kept on the mantel, my fingers numb and clumsy as I struck one against the box. The flame caught, small and fragile, and I touched it to the kindling with trembling hands. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The wood was cold, too cold, and the tiny flame seemed to shrink against an invisible pressure that pushed back against its warmth. Then from somewhere deep within the chimney came a sound. A scraping, scratching noise that descended slowly, deliberately, like something climbing down from a great height. I froze, the match burning toward my fingers, unable to move or breathe as the sound grew louder, closer. The kindling finally caught, a small burst of flame that pushed back the darkness just enough for me to see something in the mouth of the fireplace. A face, or what might have been a face, twisted and elongated beyond any human proportion. Its eyes were holes, deep and endless, and its mouth stretched in a smile that seemed to wrap around its entire head. I screamed, and the sound broke whatever spell had held me frozen. I fed the fire with desperate haste, throwing log after log onto the growing flames until they roared with renewed intensity. The thing in the chimney retreated, pulled back by the heat and light, but not before I heard it speak. A single word, exhaled on breath that smelled of ash and forgotten things. Soon. I did not sleep again that night. When grandmother found me in the morning, still crouched by the fire with wild eyes and shaking hands, she merely nodded as if she had expected nothing less. The knock came on the third night, just after sunset. 3 heavy blows against the front door, spaced with mechanical precision. We all heard it, frozen in the midst of our various activities, and we all remembered Rule 8 at exactly the same moment. No one moved. No one spoke. The fire crackled and the radio played its endless carols, but beyond those sounds there was only silence. Then the knock came again, and with it a voice. "Eleanor," it called, and the sound was grandmother's name spoken in grandmother's own voice, perfect in every detail. "Eleanor, I forgot my key. Please let me in." But grandmother was standing right beside me, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. She shook her head slowly, a warning to all of us, and we remained motionless as the thing outside continued its performance. "It's so cold out here," the voice pleaded, still perfectly mimicking grandmother's tone. "Please just open the door for a moment." Marcus was the one who moved. I saw his hand reaching for the doorknob before my mind fully registered what he was doing, drawn by some compulsion I could not understand. Grandmother caught his wrist just in time, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. "That is not me," she whispered fiercely. "And whatever it is, it cannot enter unless we invite it." The knocking continued throughout the night, shifting voices with each attempt. My mother, my father, friends from school, a police officer claiming there had been an accident. Each voice was perfect, each plea more convincing than the last. But we held firm, pressed together in the center of the living room while the thing outside circled the house and tested every window, every door. When dawn finally broke, the voices stopped. But through the frosted glass, I could see footprints in the snow. They circled the house in an unbroken ring, too many to count, and they did not lead anywhere. They simply appeared, as if the thing that made them had materialized from the air itself and returned to the same nothing when the sun rose. Grandmother gathered us together that morning, her expression grave. "The rules are not traditions," she said, confirming what I had already begun to suspect. "They are binding, a protection that has kept this family safe for generations. But protections only work when they are observed." She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze lingering on Marcus and Lily with particular intensity. "3 rules have been broken. The binding is weakening, and what waits outside grows stronger with each failure." Christmas Eve descended upon us like a sentence, and the house that had once felt so warm and welcoming now seemed to close in with every passing hour. The decorations that adorned every surface had taken on a sinister quality, their cheerful colors mocking our growing desperation. The tinsel caught the firelight and threw reflections that looked like grasping fingers. The ornaments on the tree seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye, their painted faces twisting into expressions of silent malice. Grandmother had forbidden all music after what happened the previous night, but someone had forgotten to turn off the old radio in the corner. As the clock crept toward midnight, the carols continued to play, their familiar melodies now threading through the house like poisoned honey. The stroke of 12 brought a change in the music. The cheerful tune warped, slowing and deepening until the words became incomprehensible, until the melody itself seemed to crawl from the speakers like something alive and hungry. Rule 10 had been broken, and the consequences manifested almost immediately. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move independently of the light. They stretched and reached, pooling together in the center of the ceiling like dark water finding its level. Within those gathered shadows, shapes began to form. Not the single face I had glimpsed in the chimney, but many faces, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all pressed together in a mass of hollow eyes and stretching mouths. They did not speak, but I could hear them nonetheless. Their voices bypassed my ears entirely, speaking directly into my thoughts with words that felt old, ancient, worn smooth by countless repetitions across generations beyond counting. The binding breaks. The feast approaches. All will be shared. I understood then what grandmother had always known. This was not a haunting in the conventional sense. This was something far older, a bargain struck in desperation by ancestors who had not fully understood what they were agreeing to. The rules were not protections against an external threat. They were terms of a contract, payments due to something that had been promised far more than anyone should have been willing to give. The shadows descended from the ceiling, flowing down the walls like thick oil, and wherever they touched, the festive decorations began to change. The red of the ribbons darkened to the color of old blood. The green of the garlands withered to the shade of decay. The lights flickered and died, one by one, until only the fire remained to hold back the encroaching darkness. My family pressed together in the center of the room, surrounded on all sides by shadows that were no longer content to merely watch. They reached for us with fingers made of darkness, cold and grasping, and wherever they touched exposed skin, they left marks like frostbite. Then grandmother stepped forward, placing herself between us and the advancing darkness. She reached into her pocket and withdrew something small, something that caught the firelight and gleamed with a brightness that seemed to push the shadows back ever so slightly. The holly pendant, I realized, the one she never removed. She began to speak words in a language I did not recognize, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the crackling of the fire. The shadows hesitated, their advance slowing but not stopping entirely. Whatever power the pendant held, it was not enough. Not anymore. "The binding is too weak," grandmother said, her voice strained with effort. "Too many rules broken. There is only one way to satisfy them now." She turned to look at us, and in her eyes I saw acceptance, resignation, and a love so fierce it burned brighter than the fire behind her. "Rule 12, she said. "The feast must be shared with all, even those who do not seem to eat." I remembered the words, remembered wondering what they meant, who the unseen guests might be. Now, looking at the shadows that surrounded us, I understood. The feast was not food. It had never been food. The feast was us. Grandmother reached for the poker beside the fireplace, and for one terrible moment, I thought she meant to use it as a weapon. Instead, she placed its tip in the flames until the metal glowed red, then pressed it against the center of her palm. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and her face contorted with pain, but she did not cry out. "By blood and fire," she said, her voice steady despite the agony, "I offer myself as the feast. Take me and let my family go." The shadows surged forward with a sound like 1,000 voices sighing in satisfaction. They wrapped around grandmother in a cocoon of darkness, lifting her from the floor, and as they did, the holly pendant fell from her grasp and clattered against the hardwood. I lunged for it, my fingers closing around the cool metal just as the shadows began to retreat, taking grandmother with them. For one brief moment, her eyes met mine through the swirling darkness, and she smiled. Then she was gone, and the shadows with her, and the living room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft, broken sounds of my family's grief. Christmas morning arrived, but there was no joy in it. The presents beneath the tree remained unwrapped, their cheerful packaging now seeming like cruel mockery. The stockings hung empty on the mantel. The fire had burned down to embers, and none of us had the will to rebuild it. Grandmother Eleanor was simply gone. There was no body to bury, no evidence that she had ever been there at all except for the holly pendant that I still clutched in my trembling hand. When we searched her room later that morning, we found it empty of personal effects, as if someone had packed everything away in preparation for a departure they had always known was coming. But in the mahogany cabinet, beside the leather-bound journal of rules, we found a letter. It was addressed to all of us, written in grandmother's careful handwriting, and dated 3 days before our arrival. "My dear family," it began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened and I am no longer with you. Do not grieve for me longer than necessary. I have known for many years that this day might come, and I made my peace with it long ago." The letter went on to explain what she had never been willing to tell us while she lived. The origin of the rules, the nature of the bargain, the terrible price that had been paid to secure our family's protection through generations of Christmas Eves. Our ancestor, a woman named Margaret Winters, had made a deal with something on the longest night of the year nearly 200 years ago. Her children were starving, her husband dead of fever, and she was desperate enough to answer when something spoke to her from the darkness beyond her window. She offered it whatever it wanted in exchange for her family's survival and prosperity. It agreed, but its price was specific. Every Christmas Eve, forever after, her descendants would observe 12 rules without fail. And if those rules were ever broken, the bargain would be renegotiated in blood. For 7 generations, the rules had been followed. For 7 generations, our family had prospered. But the thing that had made the bargain was patient, and it had learned to wait, to whisper, to tempt. It wanted more than annual observance. It wanted the binding to break. It wanted to feast. I have taken its hunger upon myself, grandmother's letter concluded. But understand this, the bargain is not ended. It is merely suspended. Next Christmas Eve, the rules will apply again. The binding will reset, and you will have another chance to maintain it or another opportunity to fail. I have bought you time, nothing more. Use it wisely. We left the farmhouse that afternoon, driving through snow that had begun to melt under a weak winter sun. None of us spoke during the 3-hour journey home. None of us knew what to say. The world outside the car windows looked exactly as it always had, mundane and ordinary, but we knew now that ordinariness was an illusion. Beneath the surface of every Christmas celebration, something old and hungry waited for its due. The holly pendant hangs around my neck now, a constant reminder of the weight I carry. I have memorized the 12 rules. I have studied the journal grandmother left behind, learning every detail of the rituals required to maintain the binding. When next December comes, I will return to the farmhouse, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that no rules are broken. But I am not naive enough to believe that I will succeed forever. The thing that took grandmother is patient, can wait another year, another decade, another century. It knows that eventually someone will forget. Someone will rebel. Someone will decide that the rules are nothing but superstition and choose to ignore them. And when that happens, it will come again. As I write this, it is nearly Christmas Eve once more. The snow has begun to fall outside my window, and the familiar carols have started playing on the radio. In a few hours, I will make the long drive to grandmother's farmhouse, alone this year, to perform the rituals that keep my family safe. I have hung the stockings early. I have locked all the windows. I have prepared the fire and laid out the cookies and milk. I have done everything exactly as the rules prescribe. But as darkness falls and the longest night begins, I cannot shake the feeling that something is different this year. Something in the quality of the silence. Something in the way the shadows seem to lean toward the light. And from somewhere far away, carried on the cold wind that rattles my windows, I could swear I hear a voice. Grandmother's voice. "Let me in," it whispers. "I forgot my key. I will not answer." I know what waits beyond that door, wearing her face and speaking with her stolen tongue. But the voice continues, patient and persistent, and I know it will not stop until dawn breaks or I make a mistake. 12 rules, 12 chances to fail, and something that has all the time in the world to wait for its feast. Merry Christmas, and may your traditions protect you from what lurks in the longest night.